That jingle, Ben, never gets old. All right, let's get into what we're
We
going to talk
we,
about
we
today.
made one mistake in that
Uh,
jingle.
what's that?
It should it wouldn't be as catchy probably, but it should be Benthany talk about SQL Server 2025. We didn't get
Yeah,
Benthany in there.
no, I'll talk to the producer.
Yes, please.
Cool.
And then we're going to
Ben.
redo all the previous episodes.
Yeah, right. All right, Ben. What we're going to do today is we're going to get into a little bit deeper of a dive on using SP invoke external REST endpoint and talk about some scenarios that you could leverage this new stored procedure in to really drive some interesting events or some interesting interactions
Yeah,
between systems, right? So why don't we kick it off, Ben? Tell us what you got.
cool. So I'm in VS Code as requested. I'm
Finally.
still using notebooks as the cool kids do. So I got my CTP 2.0 here. First thing here, I'm just deleting my REST API demo database if it exists, creating it from scratch, creating my master key, enabling REST endpoint. We've been through that in all our previous demos, so people know the drill by now, I guess. And let's start with a very, very simple API, just to get warmed up. So there's datausa.io, and it's a public API, no authentication or nothing. You can get all kinds of metrics across the US. So I'm saying drill down by state, get me the population, get me the latest number you have, which is apparently 2023. So you don't have any idea how many people live in the US this year and last year, apparently, or at least that
Negative.
API doesn't.
Right.
Anyways, what are we doing here? I'm declaring my response as an nvarchar max because we have no idea how big that JSON is going to be. So nvarchar max is a good choice
It's the
for
way to
that.
go. Yeah.
Executing that stored procedure, SP invoke external REST endpoint, and I'm providing my URL, my method, so which can be get or post, and I'm linking that output, that response back into my variable here so I can later use it. So in this case, I'm just doing an open JSON and getting the result.data part of that JSON because otherwise you would also get like all the headers and the status and all
Right.
that. We don't
Mhm.
need that. And of course, I could format all that nice and get JSON values. I'm going to show you that in a slightly later demo. But super easy and 0.2 seconds. Overhead was not. Would that be something I want to be fired a million times per second? Probably not.
Right.
But also the overhead is very neglectable. I guess that's what I'm saying. Many APIs do require authentication, though. So let's basically do the same thing that we did before against a slightly different API. There's regress.in, another public and free API. I mean, you can tell by that key, regress free v1, that this is not a very specific Ben API key, but it helps you with testing those things. There's actually a ton of free APIs out there. So if you don't have something that you can try on, or you got some data that you're like, well, I don't want to access that just yet using that function, there's a ton of APIs out there you can just try out. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding a header to my request where I'm just providing my X API key. And again, that syntax, or rather the name of that variable, may vary a bit API by API, but you will find that in the documentation of the specific API. However, I'm going to keep saying however a lot on this episode, storing code in plain text or secrets in your code in plain text is
Not
not
a good
ideal
practice.
unless you use something so strong. But if you're
Right.
not,
Sometimes it carries us away.
there's that.
Mhm.
So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a database scope credential, which I'm naming as the URL of the endpoint I'm calling. That is important. Just give it any name, and your SP invoke external REST endpoint will tell you cannot use that credential because it's trying to avoid you just using that credential, sending it to one of your bogus websites, Anthony, and then logging all my passwords. This is not how things work, Anthony. So it is of type or identity HTTP point endpoint headers. So right here, rather than having my key in plain text, I'm just linking it to that credential. There is no way of decrypting that credential for the user. So if I don't want the user to even have that key, but still be able to access that API, that's one very neat thing of doing that. So I run that, same result. And by the way, we should also have an episode on the new JSON functionality because, like I said earlier, we could very easily just format that all so nicely. We could cast around that or format around that
Right.
in any way that makes sense. But let's not get carried away by that. Remember our very first episode, or also the last episode, where we talked about AI and vectors and all that?
Hmm.
So using that exact same Olama installation that we talked about last time and on our first episode, except that my Olama is actually running on bare metal, but I still don't have GPUs because that VM simply doesn't have any. I could also chat with that BenGPT-ish. What's the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? And it's going to give me the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow is not definitely known. That is very disappointing, as per the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, yada, yada. One very important thing is, unlike the embeddings, which will always be the same, that answer will almost never be the same. If I execute that again, it may take a bit longer, it may be a different answer, etc., etc. I can use that to talk to that endpoint and ask it questions. Would I do that to build a chatbot? No. But let's assume that you want to use your own data. So out of my conference sessions database from the first episode, I'm building a prompt that's basically said, you're at a conference called Past Data Community Summit. You attended the session below. Please write a LinkedIn post about what you liked about. And then I'm just providing the speaker's name, the title of the session, and the description. So if I pass that to my model, I'm now using my own data to build that prompt, and the result, the response will be catered based on my own data. And if you think about all the different use cases for Gen AI, hey, I only have very, very long descriptions for my product. I need something very neat that is less than 500 words. And you just pass every single one of them to that API and get it updated as one of the many, many examples.
That's a pretty cool. That's a pretty good use case there, Ben. Like that one.
However, my advice would be, I'm using a very small model here, the small M2. Use a proper model that actually fits your needs, because let's see what it says this time. Last time I ran this, it described Ben Weisman as someone who recently joined Microsoft. Well, let's see what's going to be the output this time. I did not join Microsoft. Maybe the output this time is that I became CEO of Microsoft. Who knows? So there we go. Excited to share. Yeah, Ben Weisman's talk on Microsoft's new Azure Arc service was truly eye-opening. Well, Azure Arc is not exactly a new service. So that's what we're talking. That's what I mean. That's where things are going into slightly different, but it's nicely formatted. It has links in it, etc., etc. Pretty cool stuff. And again, using all my own data, just using that external REST endpoint thingy. The only thing I did here, rather than passing headers, is I was passing on a payload. And the other thing is I was providing a timeout. By default, any REST endpoint will time out in 30 seconds. I increased that slightly to 230 seconds because 30 seconds wouldn't have cut it with my non-GPU enabled box here. I got another nice and free API out there called the Exchange Rates API. It also requires an API key, so I run this, passing it here in my URL. But we talked about how it's not cool of storing that API key right in your code, right? So I'm creating another credential, running this, and we're getting missing access key. And the reason for that is this API, unlike the previous one, expects this API key to actually store it in the query string, not getting posted to it.
Okay.
Different APIs behave differently. Unlike me, I never behave. So I'm altering my database scope credential here and changing it from HTTP endpoint headers to HTTP endpoint query string. Running this again. Nice. So we're going to put that also in the wrap up. But I think one of the very important things is when you're starting to work with REST APIs, and especially that specific stored procedure, either you're way smarter than me, or you will probably run into tons of situations where, like, this is not the result I was expecting. It's usually very little things. My first suggestion is always use something like CRL or Postman to try out if you're actually doing the right thing to that API before seeing if that actually does the right thing in SQL Server.
So you want to test your code before you run it, Ben? Is that what's happening?
From time to time, I do that. Well,
Okay.
I usually always do, and then I have people messing with it. I once did a pre-con at a conference, and then somebody was messing with my demos. It didn't go down too well. But
It's like we have trust issues, Ben.
yeah, well, one of us does. One of us has now since then. So, anyways, another very important thing is we talked about the response. Let's also talk about a result. The response, or what we're saving as our response from that output here, is what's actually coming back from that REST endpoint. SP invoke external REST endpoint also comes back with a return code that you can store in a variable, which I'm just calling result here. And that's called, in that case, it's 0. You will always want it to be 0. So if you're actually using this in code, especially if you're using that as part of a larger proc or something like that, always check that the result of that stored proc was actually 0. If it's
Yeah.
not, like here, for example, all I did is I left out the credential. I'm getting a 401 unauthorized, can get all kinds of different errors. This is something. And if you look in the actual response, it will usually tell you what's happening here. You have not supplied an API access key. So yeah, that makes sense. We probably need to fix that. So check that in your code and also check that while you're testing out the feature. So we talked about API keys. We talked about handing them through query strings or posting them as an endpoint header. Many, 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 and many, many more REST APIs use OAuth. So you need a token that you can generate yourself, but you need to refresh it from time to time. Some have it expiring after days, some have it expiring after minutes or even seconds. They all work the same way, essentially. So I'm using the Amadeus endpoint here, using the SP invoke external REST endpoint, and just concatenating all that into a header and then a create database scope credential T-SQL here that I'm also dynamically executing using SP execute SQL. I have a feeling some people will not like this. I'm going to get some very nasty comments for doing that. Still, first of all, it's a demo. And second of all, for this specific use case, I think this is fine. But we can also agree to disagree. What I'm basically doing here is take a look at that token. If I'm running this again, that token will change and it will change again. So now I've just generated 3 tokens, but I've also stored them as a credential. So if I go down here and access the Amadeus API, I can use it, for example, to look for flights from Nuremberg to Memphis tomorrow. Ooh, Anthony,
Yo,
it's 7.5 grand and it's 15 hours, 43 minutes. I'm not sure I'm going to make it tomorrow. Maybe I'll come see you another day.
fine.
Also, last time I tried to come see you, the world shut down. So let's
not do that.
okay. So now you may be wondering, Ben, this is all very nice, but why are you showing me how to search for flights using SQL Server? And I would agree. My point that I was trying to make was the entire token thingy, because like I said, many, many, many APIs do that. Let's do that with management.azure.com. Same code, different endpoint, also slightly different username. Now, for example, that's the disk behind the VM I'm running this demo from. I could now create a snapshot of that disk. I could increase the size of that disk. I could potentially shut down the VM running that demo using that API. That may be not the smartest of ideas. And that works in Azure, but it works basically with all kinds of vendors. You just published a blog post recently on how you can do it with a pure array where you can create a snapshot using your REST API. So
Right.
it opens a ton of opportunities with regards to working with data, pushing it. We didn't even talk about pushing data through an API. Well, we kind of did when we used that prompt when I attended my own session. But there's tons of more data. But also from a management perspective, talking to management endpoints, that thing could send an email, that thing could create a snapshot, that thing could do all kinds of things. It could fire up maybe have another VM that needs to be fired up only because it's very expensive once certain things have completed. So I could build a whole level of orchestration in here. And now we could
Absolutely.
have that educated discussion on, do you want your orchestration to be part of your stored proc? And my answer as a consultant would always be, well, it depends. Not necessarily as the default, but if all I'm running is a stored proc and then I need that one single piece of orchestration in there, I think it's very neat that I could put it in there rather than having something else to check if that stored proc has finished, et cetera, et cetera. So it may not be a one size fits all, but it's a very, very cool feature with tons of use cases. What do you think? Is it time for the music?
I think it's time for the music, Ben.